The airlock of the mighty spacecraft hissed closed. A coiling wisp of white vapor was sent edging from the vent. It curled softly through the air as it slowly faded out of existence. There was a subtle smell of lilac nobody cared about, and was therefore not worth mentioning. A young man watched on. He gulped and swallowed, and looked on with enough apprehension that every orifice in his body was seemingly clenched hard enough to turn coal into a diamond. Darren White stepped from the airlock onto the dirty floor plates of the ship. He was clearly a boring man, and such details as the subtle smell of venting gases actually mattered to him. He was glad that somebody had thought to mention it after all. He whipped out his electronic pad and made a note of this precise detail. As he did this, he huffed indignantly to himself. His ruddy red face was that of a man who really had nothing better to do. He took something from his pocket and held it up for the man before him to see quite plainly. The young man was flustered and gulped nervously at the sight of the silver cylinder. He didn't really want to be there. Mr. White unscrewed it and took out a single green tablet, handing it over and fixing him with a disarming stare. It was the stare of a predator gazing at its prey. It was the glare of a teacher regarding the class clown. It was the look on the face of a parent who had been hoping to have grandchildren, while their eldest child explained that they were interested in writing poetry. The younger man reached out and gingerly received it. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he screwed up his eyes and swallowed it with nervous disgust. Mr. White glared up from under his brow at the junior civil officer and pointed back to the airlock. "Young man, did you see that?" The younger man said nothing and just gave a little shrug. Mr. White made a grumbling noise from the back of his throat, a sound he'd mastered over many years of honing his talents at making slight grumbling noises. "The pill works rather quickly," he said dryly, and a little smugly besides. "You should by now be quite incapable of telling me a single lie." The younger man hadn't seen whatever it was and looked around, perhaps wondering what exactly it was he was referring to. For some reason he said, "Sir, my finger was nowhere near my nose." The pill hadn't fully taken effect yet, but it could just be seconds now. His brain was already struggling to find some kind of equilibrium, while a cocktail of chemicals gently massaged the sanity right out of it. The grumpy old man gave a grumpy little noise from somewhere around the back of his grumpy old throat. He frowned some more, since it appeared he was rather good at that too. Perhaps he was even better at frowning than he was at grumbling. I referred to the little cloud of smoke that came from the airlock. That can only mean that the entire system is slightly out of adjustment. The junior offer had been assigned to him with a fair amount of reluctance. The pull he had swallowed was making it rather difficult to do his job, that job being to follow the orders he had been given to make things look good during this surprise audit. It could also mean the airlock was on fire, he ventured, regretting it immediately, not that there was anything he could do to stop himself. By now, every thought was likely to come tumbling out unchecked as the pill slowly reduced him to the mental capacity of a liberal arts student. There was considerable glaring, really quite considerable. "Is the airlock on fire?" he asked, not entirely rhetorically. This was a tough answer to commit to. The problem as he saw it was that the nebulous wasn't run to the absolute highest standards, and it was quite possible that the airlock was malfunctioning horribly again. It actually could be on fire for all he knew. The crew were highly motivated to make a good impression, so they had chosen to allow the auditor to dock the port with the least amount of alcohol stopped up inside it, and he distinctly remembered nobody mentioning fires of any kind. "I don't think so, sir," he stammered. "There is a considerable amount of clutter inside the airlock," the man grumbled, tapping his pad with his finger. The least amount of clutter would have been absolutely none, which would have been ideal, and was the legal requirement. He nodded weakly. Mr. White continued, "You understand that the airlocks are an emergency exit. What would happen if I were an elephant and needed to escape to safety through such a thing due to a fire?" He winced, knowing that the only things he could say were the wrong things, and that he was going to say them anyway. "We don't have any elephants on board, sir." This was absolutely true. Also, the airlock only leads to the deadly vacuum of space, and is the only thing that's technically capable of catching fire on the whole ship, or has ever done so. That is, except for the toilets on Deck 17 on curry night. I believe that occurrence is still being investigated. The auditor didn't look too surprised, but there was a definite momentary pause. "Young man," he said, "I'm here to audit the entire ship. Could you show me to the primary reactor so I can begin my work properly? I'd like to see the radiation baffles first to make sure they're in good working order." He held up his hand, gesturing back from where he'd come. "Sir, they're in the airlock behind you." Mr. White looked up and his eyes widened. "The radiation baffles?" "In the airlock," the man agreed. "They take up a lot of space. I was told that the engineer didn't see any point in bothering with them, since the reactor isn't working properly anyway. Mr. White narrowed his eyes and made a note on his pad, giving him a caustic glare. I'm surprised you can find any room for them in there with all the alcohol you've got stored, he said sarcastically. He shrugged back, enjoying a warm sensation as the pill worked its magic on him, flooding his brain with a horrendous blend of narcotics that had no place inside a brain that envisaged a future for itself. It's not really a lot of alcohol. We store most of it around the primary reactor. Without the baffles, the beer gets a nice fizz on it, and it makes your teeth tingle when you drink it. The only problem is that we've had to double up the cat patrol since the rats are getting much larger up there. The cats ended up with glowing red eyes, but the rat problem went away when the cat started exploding. That was around the time we started having curry night. He made a note of all this. Perhaps we'll skip the visit to the reactor on this occasion, he suggested, and the grumbling took on a more pointed, almost nervous edge. Let's begin with the life support control room, shall we? I want to see the air cleaning system. He shook his head firmly, which made him a little giddy. I was told not to take you there, he admitted. The air cleaning system was moved to the waste recycling deck. It was considered an emergency measure after all the complaints we had after curry night. The medical staff ran out of pills after people began stuffing them up their nose because of the smell. In the end, the only permanent cure was to have your nostrils surgically removed. Several people chose that option, but it just made it worse. When they walked into the bathroom, they nearly all hemorrhaged to death through their eyeballs. Someone in the genetic engineering department came up with the idea of making CNI canaries to detect the worst of the gases. It seemed like a great idea. At first, that seemed to surprise him. The grumpy man just stood there for a moment staring at his pad. After a lengthy pause, he said finally, "Well, maybe we'll begin at navigation control." The young man shrugged. "I don't know where that is." He narrowed his eyes. The pills were foolproof, weren't they? "I tell you what, young man, you tell me what is working on this ship and we'll start from there." He frowned for a moment, contemplating this carefully. "There is a microwave oven in the gift shop on deck 12. I know that's working because I heated up my breakfast there this morning with a man called Dave. It tasted pretty good, had a full meaty flavour and a spicy zing. I will admit, I hadn't expected that from a bowl of porridge." The auditor's mouth lolled open, the look of a man scarcely able to believe what he was hearing. "So even the food recycling system is questionable?" he said. "I guess it depends what the question is. The logical question to begin with is, does it work?" He began to chuckle to himself, and then his knees went a little weak and he had to balance himself against a wall. "Not really, no. It's meant to recycle human waste into delicious and nutritionally balanced food supplements. For some reason, all we can make is little green plastic hats that smell like exploding cats. We started to sell them in the gift shop, but the only people buying them are the ones that had their nostrils surgically removed and whose eyes didn't explode. Everyone else is getting by eating fried seeing eye canaries." "I don't," White stammered. Professional composure was clearly becoming hard to maintain. "It can't be this bad. No ship can be run by this appalling standard. How do you not just drift around space crashing into things?" He grinned as if the feeling of having your brain fizzing away like flat beer next to an unshielded reactor was an entirely pleasant one, which perhaps it was. He was the last person to ask if he ever wanted to know. "Aren't they all run like this?" "Most ships have the good sense to adorn a facade of professionality in preparation for my short visits. I will be having stern words with your PR department." "Ah, that might be difficult." "And why is that?" "Well, it's a really long, crazy story. Basically, they all succumbed to Category Epsilon 3's space rage and fled their perceived persecutors, a small pack of exploding red-eyed cats on an unnamed escape pod. Utter lunacy. No, sir, paranoid schizophrenia." Mr. White noted this down, a slight tremble in his hand. "You could see damage control. They're usually quite busy down there, but I'm sure they'll be happy to make time for you. One of them is making a Christmas tree out of a manned navigational beacon. I hear it was really quite pretty once he hosed all the blood off it." Mr. White stammered, looking down at his pad and then back to the smiling young man as a drop of blood began to drip from his nose. "I think it might be best if I go now." He turned to glance back at the airlock. "Yeah, that might be best. Last week, one of the emergency escape modules accidentally launched on this deck. It was right above where the toilets caught fire. Even so, it probably shouldn't have fired inwards, which I didn't think was actually possible. Apparently, we were lucky that no one was in it, but less lucky that someone was in the cabin it ended up in. I think he was an auditor too, by some weird coincidence." Mr. White made a frightened little squeaky noise and began edging back to the airlock, glancing around as if the floor might give way beneath him, which was totally unreasonable since the floor beneath him had recently been replaced with the highest quality Chinese bamboo. It was guaranteed to support a fully grown elephant, even if it was on fire. Sadly, there were no elephants on board, and certainly not ones that had been in any way combustible to test that claim. Perhaps there had been at some point, which was why the bamboo had been put there in the first place. Although Chinese metal products were often compared to bamboo in an unfavourable way, Chinese bamboo was often compared to metal and fared rather better. This would have been ideal, except for the fact that it had originally been engineered to be edible. "Is this a good audit?" the young man asked, his eyes glazing over as he looked around, enjoying whatever fascinating thing only existed in his own private little world. It was a world where climate change had almost seen off most of the living creatures, and all that was left were a few bewildered pandas trying to decide whether it would be easier to try eating some of the local produce or a rusty old motorcycle frame. "I hope it's not a bad audit. I heard that if it is, you have to stay here with us and check over everything, right? It could take months." The auditor gave another little squeak. He began. "It's not that bad. You should stay," he told him. "If you microwave the hats, they taste a little bit like chicken. Apparently so do the light bulbs, but I've not tried that yet." White began shaking his head slowly. He stopped suddenly as he backed up to the wall, his eyes widening in horror as if there was no escape. "It's a good audit," he said with a lopsided smile. "It's a good audit, and I can leave. I'm allowed to leave if it's a good audit. I'm giving you 3 out of 5 stars. Not bad, but good enough. Actually, better than some." "Dave told me it would be a good audit," the young man said, as a suspicious wet patch formed in the middle of his trousers. It only made him grin more to himself as a frothing fizzing sensation filled his mind and a weird bright white light could be heard in his ears. "He showed me around and told me all about what happens on the ship. He told me exactly what it's really like, but not to tell anyone, as it was our secret." "Dave," the auditor began scratching around with his hand for the door release back to the glorious sanctity of his personal shuttle. "I don't think Dave is very clever though," he said thoughtfully. "He kept calling me collateral damage, even though my name is Graham. He said it was close enough and didn't matter in the long term since I very likely didn't have one. I wonder what he meant." It was doubtful he could see much of anything at all at this point, and most of his attention was fixed on a blank grey wall panel that oddly reminded him of his Uncle Toby. He smiled as his tongue lolled out and his hollow vacant eyes peered forward into absolutely nothing in particular, which was ironic since the very same nothing in particular was going to be happening around him for a very long time to come. The airlock hissed open. "I'm leaving," the auditor shouted, sighing a huge note of relief as he stepped away, back from the lingering threat of the ship. The door slid closed with a customary hiss. Bob looked up to Dave, who was actually another blank grey wall panel that looked nothing like him at all to anyone else at all, except perhaps an imaginary flaming elephant that was hell-bent on escaping. "Dave, I think my Uncle Toby left. That's probably for the best since he died 3 years ago. Probably has better things to do." Dave, who was a wall panel with a slight mark in the bottom left corner, just laughed. It said something intelligent, insightful, and remarkably astute. "Dave, I think we had a good audit," he slurred drunkenly, wobbling and swaying back and forth as more blood ran from his nose, his ears, his eyes, and the left side of his mouth. "I think we're safe for another year, just like you said we would be. You're not as dumb as people say. People say you're actually pretty dumb." Dave laughed again. No small feat for a very slightly dirty grey panel that wasn't really him at all. In fact, the very slightly dirty grey panel wasn't really anyone, but it was a distinction that would never concern the young man again. "I love you, Dave," he said, sinking to his knees before becoming completely overwhelmed by a ferocious attack of what had come to be known aboard the ship as curry night. The smell was appalling, and the plain grey panelling all around looked on in disgust, in a way only plain grey panelling could. The fire in the airlock continued to burn away peacefully. All was right with the world.